Welcome to another episode of the Gabby Podcast. My name is Brian Chung, and I'm the Director of Programs and Strategy at the Global American Business Institute. Today's guest is Ken Luongo, who is the president and founder of the Partnership for Global Security and the Center for a Secure Nuclear Future. He's authored over 100 articles, been a TEDx presenter, engaged extensively with global media, and briefed governments and audiences around the world on nuclear and transnational security challenges and responses. Today, we're lucky to have him here to be discussing geopolitical implications on nuclear exports. Ken, thank you for taking the time to be here with me today.
Thanks, Brian. I'm happy to be here.
So let's dive right into the questions that I had. Nuclear energy has certainly taken quite a journey, and there have been market shifts in global nuclear energy. Even before the Ukraine invasion, we saw the rise of Russia's export dominance, and I was wondering if you can talk about the factors that contributed to Russia's rise.
Well, I think one of the most remarkable things about Russia's rise in the export market is that it went from Chernobyl to the number one international exporter of nuclear reactors. So that's quite a turnaround from the bottom of the barrel to the top of the barrel. And I think they did it in a couple of different ways. One, they had a governmental commitment to this as part of their energy portfolio, right? Russia is an enormous energy powerhouse, both fossil fuel and nuclear, and they put together a government-backed package for their reactor exports that made it very attractive, especially to developing economy countries. Now, they also have had a very robust fuel production and export business as well. So as part of their package, they're able to provide financing to countries that want to build their reactors. They're able to buy, to use Russian talent for construction. They're able to use Russian operators if they're not qualified in the country or have a deep bench of people that are qualified to operate reactors. So I think it was a very attractive package to a lot of different countries. And then the other part of it is it reached its peak really during a time of kind of Western democracy, Russia, cooperation and coexistence, which has deteriorated steadily probably over the last 10 to 15 years. But it wasn't, the Americans and the European EU utilities were buying Russian fuel. We're still buying Russian fuel. Now we're going to stop buying Russian fuel. Everything kind of came to a halt in terms of Western acquiescence to Russian domination with the Ukraine war, with the invasion of Ukraine. But the other part of this that has been happening is that as a result of climate primarily, and now also because of the geopolitical situation, the US and some of its key allies, including Korea, the UK, France, are looking at rejuvenating their domestic nuclear and export opportunities. So I think for a while it was a kind of free lane for the Russians, and they had a really good deal. And now, all of a sudden, the Western side of the political equation globally has kind of woken up, and now they're ready to contest Russia. But and the Russians are also going to face a challenge from China because China is building reactors faster and in more number than anybody at this point.
Leading up into February 2022, we saw the shift in global attitudes towards nuclear when Putin invaded Ukraine. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this shift. I know you mentioned the fuel being cut off, but what are some other ways that you see some shifts, and how do you think this affects Russia's dominance?
I definitely think it's going to affect Russia's dominance in the export market. I do think that the EU countries and the United States have come to an agreement on the fuel issue. Really for 2 years plus, the United States didn't do anything about diminishing the reliance of US utilities on Russian fuel. And now they have. Now we have a bill which is a ban. There's a waiver process, but so that nobody gets caught short. But that to me that's a really big bet by the United States and other countries to cut off one of their main suppliers of enriched uranium, and to take that on as their own responsibility. I mean, the United States has a very small uranium enrichment capability at the moment, right? It's essentially centrist. There's Urenco that does it, but Russia has been a major powerhouse in that regard. On the other side of the ledger, what did Ukraine did? Well, the first thing it did was it caused the Finns to pull out of their deal with Russia for new reactor in Finland. And I think it gave pause it certainly hardened the view in other Eastern European, Central European countries that they had to find an alternative to Russian fossil fuel dependency, right? So then you see Poland making a deal with Westinghouse for 6 reactors. You see Romania looking at deploying additional reactors. You see Czech Republic looking to deploy additional reactors, and the Russians are not a part of any of those tenders. Those tenders are mostly US, Korea, France for the most part. And in fact, the United States, I think, actively moved the Chinese out of some of those deals, and then the UK moved China out of their deal. And that's the other thing I would say. The UK, kind of independent of the Ukraine issue, has made a commitment to expand its nuclear power. And I think that a lot of what happened after the Ukraine invasion was driven by this increasing division with Russia and with the authoritarian world. But the other part of it is clean energy. And I think what's become increasingly apparent, especially, let's just say, over the last 9 months or so, is that you're not going to be able to reach this goal of net zero by 2050 with just renewables. It's the cost of everything has gone up, right? I just was looking today. Ørsted, the offshore wind company, is paying New Jersey $125 million because they pulled out of this offshore wind deal. I think the entire clean energy renewable sector is facing some headwinds. The nuclear sector has been facing a lot of headwinds. I mean, the challenge for the nuclear sector in the United States and Western Europe is to get back in the game at a price point that is acceptable. I think that Ukraine has dented the Russian dominance. I think geopolitically, there's a real fear that energy dependency on Russia will diminish Western influence in some key nations. And then on top of it, what the Russians have done in Ukraine in terms of threatening civil nuclear power plants like Zaporizhzhia is outrageous. It's beyond the pale. It violates all of the rules. The International Atomic Energy Agency has documented chapter and verse on what the danger is from Russia's occupation of attacks near that nuclear power plant, and the Russians, for the most part, haven't expressed any remorse. And I think that makes it very clear that this is a country that doesn't play by the rules. And if you're going to have a build out of nuclear energy, everybody has to play by the rules, because it's something that needs to be managed effectively.
Yeah, I see. And I did want to pull on a thread that you did bring up earlier, which was China. And China hasn't really been engaging in a lot of exports, but as you mentioned, there is some concern with their ability to compete. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, China is, among all of the nuclear energy countries in the world, China is building the most reactors, has the ambition to build the most reactors, et cetera. So it had, the benefit for China is that it has a very state-sponsored, integrated hot production line workforce and ability to build their reactors. They have attempted to become a party to other deals. As I mentioned, Romania in particular is one case, and the other is the UK. For national security reasons, the UK decided not to move forward with China as a partner. And the United States, I think, had a very strong influence on Romania and made essentially the same case. So So right now, the main exports from China are to Pakistan, though they are also talking with Argentina and others. I think that once they start building more of their domestic reactor, the Hualong 1, and it's operating in China and it has a record of safety, I think it will be more competitive overseas um, in a way that the Westinghouse AP 1000 or the Korean APR 1400 or the French reactors have a track record. People understand how to operate them. So I think that as usual, you need to build domestically before you can export. But China is a major threat because they have a lot of the same package opportunities of financing, workforce, et cetera, that the Russians have. And they have one very big advantage, which is Belt and Road Initiative, where they're working with, almost 100 countries on infrastructure projects. We looked into what they're doing under Belt and Road on energy, and most of that is coal plants in developing economy countries. There hasn't been any nuclear plants, but that's certainly an opportunity. And for those countries where smaller reactors may be a better fit for their grid and their needs. The Chinese are working also on these advanced reactors, smaller output reactors, with a particular focus, I think, on molten salt as a coolant. And so, I see China not as a major threat at the moment, but like all things nuclear power, where we are today, you need to cast out 15 to 20 years beyond and try to figure out where you're going to be. It takes 7 or 8 years to build a reactor under the best conditions. Maybe in China it's shorter, but I think in UAE for the Korean reactors it was around 6, 7 years. So you can't just think about, okay, where are we today? You have to think about, okay, what does the marketplace look like? What countries do we want to be in? With what products and how do we do that? And what's not clear to me is that that the United States in particular has really thought through that export market beyond Central and Eastern Europe, which they clearly have thought through and have been very active in for a long time. But I think we need to look globally. The biggest places of population growth and energy demand are definitely in a developing world, in particular in Africa. But now we have also this new potential surge in energy need in the United States with data centers fueling AI, et cetera. So the game has really changed, I would say, over the last 6 months domestically. I still don't think that we're prepared on a global basis. We're doing fine in Central Europe, but I'm not sure we're doing great in the rest of the world.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point with the data centers and the AI is driving kind of a new and unexpected demand. And on top of that, we've been hearing from the industrial sector too, even the oil and gas and the petrochemicals, that they're also looking into nuclear as a way to kind of decarbonize and fit their energy needs as well, which kind of leads into my next question, which is about the upcoming demand. And last year at COP28, we saw the mention of nuclear in the global stocktake for the first time. And we also saw a pledge from a number of countries to commit to tripling global nuclear capacity by 2050. And I'm very curious your thoughts on this. Currently, the global capacity, according to the World Nuclear Association, is approximately 396 gigawatts. And tripling this capacity by 2050 means building around 792 gigawatts of new nuclear in about 25 years. Do you think the world could build 792 gigawatts in 25 years? What would be needed to reach these goals, and where do you think we'll realistically end up in 2050 in terms of new capacity?
I think there's going to be new capacity. I don't think it's going to be tripled. I think when you look, as you mentioned, either IEA or IAEA on a World Nuclear Association, I think actually it's this 396 gigawatts. Each large reactor is somewhere around 1 to 1.2 or so gigawatts. So you're talking about 700 new reactors. I think that is unrealistic from an engineering, procurement, and construction point of view. I think it's unrealistic from a workforce point of view. I mean, I just don't think there's enough infrastructure, except in China. I mean, China, I ultimately, as I understand it, did not sign on to this COP pledge in Dubai, but they did in Belgium at this IAEA conference. And so, yeah, China's goal is to build 300 reactors, so additional reactors, and so yeah, that's what's going to lead the charge here, I think, in terms of tripling nuclear energy. But that pledge wasn't very specific about country by country. It was generally globally, this is what we need to do. I think the bigger point about that pledge is a couple of things. Number one, as you know, nuclear has struggled for a number of years to be part of the clean energy technology portfolio suite of solutions, and that really cemented nuclear power as a major contributor to zero carbon. And today, the White House put on a new fact sheet talking about how they're going to support the domestic nuclear industry. I mean, all of these things, the Congress has been extremely supportive going back to the Trump administration. The United States has been extremely active, both in the executive branch and in the legislative branch, in trying to help rebuild U.S. capacity and relevance in the civil nuclear sector, both domestically and internationally. But it's a big climb out of a deep hole. And a lot of the capability that was developed for the big build out, which really peaked in the 1980s, has diminished. I think you saw this at the Vogtle plant construction, where the first plant was way over budget, and then the next plant came in about 30% below that. But you're talking about a lot of over $20 billion for these reactors.
Right.
So we have to get better and more competitive. This is an interesting thing, because if you look, for example, at the Czech Republic, I consider that to be an extremely interesting case, because the government of the Czech Republic is saying, we want a set price per reactor, and we want them built in a time frame that meets our needs. And so in the Czech Republic, the U.S. companies, primarily Westinghouse and their partners, were dismissed from the competition because they couldn't make a guarantee of what that reactor price would be, because there's a lot of variables associated with it. The combination of Bechtel, which is a major construction company, and Westinghouse, which is the engineering and design firm. But the Koreans have demonstrated to a large degree that they can do it roughly on time and on budget in the UAE. And so that now becomes an advantage for the Korean entities that are in the nuclear marketplace. So can Korea build 700 reactors around the world? I doubt it. In fact, I know they can. I know that we can. I don't think any one country can do it. It's not, there's a lot of runway that needs to be built before you could do something like that. Do I think we could increase it by a third, or maybe 200 gigawatts or something like that? I think that's possible. It's still a lot of reactors, but I think that would depend by 2050 on what's happening with smaller reactors, in the 300 megawatt range, like NuScale or other advanced reactors that are in the 100 to 300 megawatt range, and that you can link together so you can get variable power outputs, and which are, as you said, useful for industrial purposes, useful for data center purposes, et cetera. So to me, the big takeaway is nuclear is no longer an orphan in the debate about either geopolitics or about clean energy. It now is very much centered in both of those. There is a huge political lag, I would say, because there's still a lot of opposition from environmental organizations and anti-nuclear people in general. But I think if climate is your real concern, then this is your most durable technology in terms of multi-decade and also constant output. But it's the upfront cost is very expensive, and that's what deters people sometimes. But again, if we're serious about zero carbon, you have to get serious about how it is that you're going to do it on a relatively smaller footprint than it would take, say, for wind or solar. And then on the geopolitical side, again, I think it really depends. You have to figure out what are the markets that are most relevant and ready for this technology. And as you may know, we have this very detailed database that looks at parameters from a wide variety of countries to try and assess which ones are most ready for nuclear energy. And I have to say, those countries that are most suitable for small reactor output are very far away from being ready to absorb it or operate it or have the regulatory security and safety capability that's required, right? I mean, the UAE went from a standing start to 4 reactors by essentially importing all of the talent that they needed, building out their capability domestically, and then essentially committing to being a nuclear operator for the rest of this century. That cost a lot of money. I'm not sure every country has that kind of money, but I mean, those are the kinds of creative solutions we need to be thinking about if you really want to do this. It's not just building a reactor and looking at a dome. There's a whole tail that goes along with that, which is workforce and supply chain and EPC, construction people, et cetera, and the ability to do it in a cost effective is not probably the right word, but in a way that comes in on the budget that's acceptable.
Given how Russia and China are looking at these export markets, what do you see as opportunities for cooperation between the allied nations? Where do we draw the line between cooperation and competition?
We haven't. We haven't done a good job of that. I think the situation between the United States and South Korea is a perfect example of how we're not cooperating effectively. We've been essentially in a standoff for 4 years over, licensing issues and intellectual property issues, all of which were, I think, totally preventable. But the origins of that fight between the United States and South Korea were in a different world. It was in a very meager nuclear market. The opportunities were small. Now the opportunities have expanded quite substantially. And I think that, part of the problem, as you know, with a lot of disputes is they become internalized and then it becomes very, very difficult to overcome them. It's in the arbitration court, and I'm hopeful that the arbitration court will be able to slice through this knot, and the U.S. and South Korea will be able to cooperate. But outside of the fight, the two countries and the two companies, KHNP and Westinghouse, are highly dependent on one another for parts for. I think in the UAE there was something like $2 billion plus of content that Westinghouse provided to those reactors while the Koreans built them. And I think that commercial disputes are about money, and the governments haven't really been putting their fingers on the scale to solve this. Certainly the Moon administration previously in South Korea didn't have much interest in nuclear power, and so didn't really step in to try and solve the problem at the front end, which would have been a lot more effective. It may be that for the time being or the foreseeable future, there will be competition and codependency. But I think if you really want to beat Russia and really what it is beating Russia and then preventing China from emerging in the market. I think you need a better collaborative relationship on targeting markets, on building capacity in the countries that you've targeted, in making sure that there are high standards, and making sure that the IAEA, when they have to put together recommendations for next-gen reactors on security and safety and safeguards, et cetera, that it is high-standard countries that are doing it. Because as you see with Russia, they will undermine the standards if it's in their interest, as they're doing in Ukraine. And China, I think hasn't really been a player internationally except for in Pakistan. So it's hard to know how they would react uh, to that kind of an initiative. But my view is there's so much more that we should be doing collaboratively, certainly between the United States and Canada and the UK and the EU and South Korea and Japan. But it's kind of fragmented, and there's not a lot of unity associated with it. That's why I'm interested in what the White House put out today. It's mostly domestically focused. I think it would be useful to have a corollary on the international side. And certainly, I think we need to get over the balkanization of governments in kind of one silo and industry is in another silo, and then people like you and I that care about how the pieces fit together and competitiveness and getting this into the marketplace and deploying technologies are kind of in another basket, and the national security people are in another basket. And we really need to cut. We do, I think, outside of the government and industry, talk a lot across these issues. But there's still barriers, I think, among all these different silos. And the interesting thing is in Russia, it's top down, right?
Right.
It's Russ Adams says, here's what we want to do. The Russian government says, here's the pool of money, and then they don't have to negotiate with anybody they don't have to go to private finance the way American companies do. To a lesser degree, Korea, which has some government support. It's a much more streamlined top-down process. In America, it's a lot messier and fractured, and I would like to be able to make it less fractured.
No, I totally hear what you're saying, and I'm hoping that this fact sheet is the first step in a long pathway to the right direction. Because I think certainly we would not want to see Russia and China's dominance dictating the safety, security, non-proliferation standards of nuclear around the world.
No, I mean it's clear that their standards are not as strong as those of the United States. In fact, some of our allies don't have standards that are as strong as the United States. But that being said, we're essentially unified on the need for high standards. The fact sheet, I haven't had a chance to digest it because it just came out this morning. But I think it's definitely a step in the right direction, and in a way brings together a lot of different threads that have been out there in one package. But what's most shocking and remarkable about it is that here's a Democratic administration that is fully supporting the role of nuclear energy in climate. That fact sheet, as I quickly reviewed it, is mostly about clean energy. But the geopolitical side is equally important. And so it would be great if there was a similar product on the international side. As you know, the Yoon Moon summits with Biden, the statements on nuclear energy started high about cooperating on third markets and then deteriorated last June into basically let's agree to disagree.
Yeah.
I thought that was a very bad trend line that I hope we can move in the opposite direction.
I really appreciate you taking the time and providing me with your insights. I'd like to give you a chance to give any closing thoughts or thoughts on any topics that we didn't get to cover here today.
No, I think you covered a lot of what the important thing is. My view, as I tried to articulate it, is I think there was a period of, for lack of a better term, of a cheerleading nuclear into the climate technology space, right? And I think that period culminated in November with the COP28 announcement. I mean, there were previous announcements, like previous COPs going back to Scotland, where nuclear was incrementally making its way into the climate debate. Yeah. The Dubai Declaration on tripling nuclear energy really was it's clearly a flag that's been planted among European American nations, Canada, I guess I would say North America and European nations, and Northeast Asia on the importance of nuclear energy for climate. And so we've now passed the point of cheerleading it onto the agenda. And now the issue is, how are we going to deploy it? And that is a much more complicated question. It has a lot of financial aspects to it, has technological aspects to it. It has demonstrate, you have to demonstrate, you have, and then on top of it, I really think that this decision by the Biden administration to sign this legislation on the Russian uranium ban is a major risk, because they're basically saying we need to be able to produce fuel and enriched uranium in quantities that will fuel this expansion. And that is not something we're able to do right now. And so to me, it's kind of like a long pole in the tent. If we're able to do that, I think the United States, in a way, will be one symbol that the United States is back in the game. But there's lots of other things that they need to do. But my fundamental point is, it's not a matter of this should be on the agenda. It's now on the agenda. Now the question is, okay, how do we deploy it, and how do we make sure that the market is more willing to accept what the U.S. and Democratic allies have to offer rather than Russia and China?
No, that's very well said. And hopefully, from leadership with companies like yours, we can get everything right in the right direction and to where we need to go.
We can hope.
Thank you
Yeah.
again, Ken, for taking the time. I really appreciate your insights.
Thanks, Brian. I was happy to do it.